The evidence was perfect, too perfect. Every detail, every document, every record. Back-end index pointing right pointed to one man, David Carter, a respected financial analyst, a husband, a father, and according to the system, back-end index pointing right, a criminal mastermind. But here's the truth no one knew. Back-end index pointing right, the evidence was wrong. David Carter had built his life carefully. At 42, he was everything society calls successful. A senior analyst in a New York investment firm, a six-figure income, a beautiful home in the suburbs. He wasn't flashy. He didn't take risks. He believed in one thing. Back-end index pointing right, do everything by the book. Every morning, he followed the same routine. Coffee at 6:30 a.m. News headlines. Drive to work. Predictable. Stable. Safe. Until one morning, that routine ended forever. It was 7:12 a.m. David was sitting at the breakfast table when back-end index pointing right, bang, bang, bang. The door shook violently. His wife froze. His daughter dropped her spoon. Federal agents. Opened the door. Silence. Pure shock. David stood slowly, confused. This must be a mistake. He opened the door. And within seconds, back-end index pointing right, everything changed. Agents rushed in. Weapons drawn. Voices loud. David Carter, you're under investigation for financial fraud and money laundering. His mind went blank. What? No, that's not. Sir, step back. Cold metal touched his wrists. Handcuffs. Hours later, David sat in a gray interrogation room. Across from him, two federal investigators. They placed a file on the table. Thick. Heavy. Do you recognize these transactions? David looked down. Numbers. Accounts. Transfers. Millions of dollars. And next to them, backhand index pointing right, his name. This isn't possible, he whispered. But the investigator leaned forward. It is, he said calmly, because every piece of evidence leads to you. Here's something most people don't understand. Backhand index pointing right evidence doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be convincing. And in David's case, backhand index pointing right, it was overwhelming. Emails traced to his account. Transactions under his credentials. Login records from his IP address. Everything aligned. Too perfectly. David tried to explain. I didn't do this. I've never seen these accounts. But then, he made a mistake. I don't even know how these systems work like that. The investigator paused. Interesting, he said, because according to your job role, back-end index pointing right, you specialize in exactly this. In legal cases, words matter. Every sentence, every detail, because sometimes, back-end index pointing right, what you say can hurt you more than what you did. David didn't realize it yet, but he was already weakening his defense. The investigators began laying out proof. Heavy checkmark email logs. Heavy checkmark bank transfers. Heavy checkmark internal company access records. Then came the final piece. A video clip. Security footage. A man using a terminal late at night. Face unclear, but profile similar. To us, the investigator said, back-end index pointing right, this is you. David stared at the screen, because deep down, he knew something terrifying. Back-end index pointing right, it did look like him. That night, David sat alone in a holding cell. Cold walls. Dim light. His mind replayed everything. How? How could this happen? Because if the evidence was real, back-end index pointing right, then someone had built a perfect case against him. And in part 2, back-end index pointing right, you'll see how the system turned against him. Back-end index pointing right, and how one hidden detail changed everything. David had one call, one chance. He didn't call a friend. He didn't call his boss. Back-end index pointing right, he called a lawyer. Her name was Rebecca Lawson, a federal defense attorney. Cold, sharp, precise. When she entered the room, she didn't smile. She didn't waste time. She looked at David and said, back-end index pointing right, tell me everything. No lies. No guessing. And, for the first time, David realized something important. Back-end index pointing right, this wasn't about truth anymore. Back-end index pointing right, this was about proof. Rebecca reviewed the case file, page after page. Her expression didn't change. Then she closed the file and said something that hit harder than any accusation. Back-end index pointing right. If I was the prosecutor, I would win this case. David's heart dropped. What does that mean? She looked directly at him. Back-end index pointing right. It means the evidence against you is strong. Back-end index pointing right, very strong. Here's the reality. Back-end index pointing right courts don't decide what is true. Back-end index pointing right, they decide what can be proven. And right now, everything pointed to David. Rebecca leaned forward. Back-end index pointing right. If you're innocent, we don't need to prove that. Back-end index pointing right. We need to prove something else. David swallowed. What? She answered. Back-end index pointing right that the evidence is wrong. Rebecca started digging. Not into David, but into the evidence. Because sometimes, back-end index pointing right, the truth isn't in the story. Back-end index pointing right, it's in the details. She reviewed. Heavy checkmark login timestamps. Heavy checkmark IP address records. Heavy checkmark internal access logs. And then, she noticed something. A small detail. So small, most people would ignore it. But she didn't. Every login linked to David came from the same IP address. His home, his office. Everything matched. Too perfectly. Rebecca leaned back and whispered, back-end index pointing right, that's not normal. She asked David, do you ever use remote access software? David nodded. Yes, our company uses it for work systems. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. Because now, back-end index pointing right, the case had changed. If someone had access to his system, they didn't need to hack anything. They didn't need to break in. Back-end index pointing right, they could become him. Log in as him. Send emails as him. Transfer money as him. And the system would believe it. Rebecca subpoenaed company records, access logs, user permissions, admin activity, and that's when she found it. A name, hidden deep inside the system logs. Back-end index pointing right, Michael Trent, an IT administrator, someone with full system access. David recognized the name instantly. Michael Trent, quiet, reserved, always working late. The guy no one paid attention to. Rebecca dug deeper, and the pattern became clear. Every fraudulent transaction happened late at night, when David was home, when he wasn't even working, but someone else was. Back-end index pointing right, Michael Trent. Then came the final piece. A remote access session log. Timestamp, 2:13 a.m. User, David Carter. The location, back-end index pointing right, not his home. Back-end index pointing right, not his office. Back-end index pointing right, a private server. Registered under. Back-end index pointing right, Michael Trent. The courtroom was silent. The prosecution was confident. Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows. But then, Rebecca stood up, and everything changed. She presented the logs. Step by step. Clear. Simple. Ladies and gentlemen, back-end index pointing right, this is not David Carter. Back-end index pointing right, this is someone using David Carter. The room froze. The judge leaned forward. The prosecutor stopped writing. Rebecca continued. Back-end index pointing right, the system was not hacked. Back-end index pointing right, it was accessed. Back-end index pointing right by someone with full control. And then, she said the name. Back-end index pointing right, Michael Trent. Within days, Michael Trent was arrested. The truth came out. He had used his admin access to frame David, to create heavy checkmark fake transactions, heavy checkmark false logs, heavy checkmark manipulated records. David was cleared. Charges dropped. Case closed. But something was missing. Back-end index pointing right, his life. Because even when you're proven innocent, back-end index pointing right, the damage doesn't disappear. This case wasn't about crime. It was about something more dangerous. Back-end index pointing right, trust in systems. Because sometimes, back-end index pointing right, the system can be wrong. And when it is, back-end index pointing right, it doesn't ask questions. Back-end index pointing right, it accuses. Back-end index pointing right, in the legal world, evidence can lie. Back-end index pointing right, and sometimes, back-end index pointing right, the truth is the hardest thing to prove.